This is Wheelbearings. I'm Dan Roth.
And I'm Sam Abu Al-Samid as I traverse the streets of Oakland.
Well, you're in Oakland. I'm in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. So we're doing a driving podcast this time. We're going to talk about Tesla and manufacturability, some new thoughts about the Munro teardown, and also some Ford marketing. And then, Sam, you have a talk you're going to tack on to the end of this podcast.
Yep.
So let's get to what we're driving. And since we're driving, do we want to talk about what we're actually driving right now or what we just recently drove?
We can do both. I'll give you a little quick rundown on what I'm driving right now, which is the BMW i3S, which is the latest iteration of the i3 that recently... a second, am I in the right lane here? Nope. Okay.
Don't crash it.
No, we're fine. So yeah, the i3 is BMW's first production battery electric vehicle, and it's been on sale for I guess about 4 years now, and it's a fascinating vehicle, because it's the first relatively affordable vehicle that has a carbon fiber structure to it. This is something that prior to the i3 had been reserved basically just for supercars and race cars, and now we've got the this battery electric car. And when it first came out, it had a 23 kilowatt hour battery pack, had a range of about 85 miles or so, 90 miles. They subsequently upgraded the battery pack to, I think, 32 kilowatt hours, which took the range up to about 125 miles, and that's what's in the car I'm driving right now. And just a couple of weeks ago, they announced another update to it that will put a 40 kilowatt hour pack in this thing and take it up to about 150 mile range. And when they launch that, that will be the end of the other variant of the i3 called the i3 Rex, which is the range extended version that they have offered as an option, which had a 650cc BMW Boxer motorcycle engine in the back that could run a generator. So when your battery ran out, it could give you about another 90 miles of range on top of that by pumping some juice into the battery. So the i3 is an interesting vehicle. It evolved out of what was originally called BMW's Megacity project. It was Project I, which started in 2007. And the project, the basis of the project was to try to, figure out what is the right car for the 21st century megacity. Megacities being defined as cities with populations of greater than 10 million people. And
well, I mean, kind of, I know BMW makes cars, but really, the right car for the 21st century megacity is no car. But carry on.
Well, that's true, yes. But, if you're going to have a car, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a car that is owned by consumers. It can be a car that, it can be a shared vehicle. And in fact,
right.
That's BMW uses the i3 extensively in their Drive Now and Reach Now car sharing programs, both here and in Europe. So the i3 was designed to have a relatively small footprint, so it's fairly short overall. It's tall, which makes it feel very roomy. And it's a 5-seater. It's a 4-door with the two rear doors are rear hinged half doors that give it kind of a funky kind of look, and it gives you easier access to the back seat, which frankly is a bit tight, even for the size of this vehicle compared to a Chevy Bolt. It's not as roomy as a Bolt, especially in the back seat. But
is that because the battery and all the the range extender stuff has to be tucked behind the back seat, or is it just how
well, there's not a huge amount of room behind the back seat anyway. The battery's all under the floor.
Okay.
It's just that it's kind of short. It's kind of a strange packaging job they've done on it. But, overall, it's not bad. It's probably not something that you want to, regularly carpool with, four or five people in. But it's fine for kids, and shorter adults will have no problem back there. And frankly, I'm 5'11". I can set the front seat to where I would normally be, and I can sit behind myself without my knees touching. I just don't have a whole lot of extra clearance. So,
yeah, this just feels cramped. But
yeah.
that you said it's fascinating, and I'll agree. Everything I've read about the i3 and when I've had a chance to look them over, it's definitely a very sort of sideways look at the car on purpose, and that's kind of what we need to get us to the next step of automobiles. And it's pretty exotic for something that's kind of it's quietly exotic.
Yeah, I mean, for a car that has a starting price in the low $40,000, it's surprisingly exotic, frankly. Like I said, it's got a carbon fiber structure that makes it relatively light, very strong. This thing, you never hear any squeaks and rattles out of it, despite the fact that, it's got the rear hinge doors and there's no B-pillar. It's a very solid feeling car. And when you look at it, it's got the wheels are fairly tall. I think they're 19 or 20 inch wheels, but they're fairly narrow. So you get surprisingly, and they're staggered tires. So the front tires are a little skinnier than the rears because it's a rear wheel drive car. But it's the making the wheels taller and narrower actually reduces the aerodynamic drag, but at the same time, it still gives enough footprint to give it decent traction. So it actually handles surprisingly well. Right after I picked it up yesterday from the airport, I took a quick spin up Skyline Boulevard, which is a very narrow, twisting mountain road above Silicon Valley, and it's great fun to drive up there. And the other interesting thing that BMW does with their EVs is right from the beginning, their first two EVs were not production models; they were pilot programs that led into help them develop this vehicle. And they started in 2008 with the Mini E project, which was an electric version of the Mini of that era, which had a similar kind of drivetrain layout, battery, rear electric motor, and when I first drove it at the 2008 LA Auto Show, which, it's 10 years ago now.
We're getting old.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of which, as I'm pulling up to this red light, I look over, and there's actually an old classic Mini parked across the street from me here. It's amazing how tiny that little car is, the original Austin Mini.
Oh, yeah.
Compared, but you look around, you look at a Mini today, compared to the current state-of-the-art of vehicles, and it's tiny compared to today's vehicles, but it's huge compared to this little Mini I'm seeing right now.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, the thing that I first noticed when I drove the Mini E was that it had very aggressive regenerative braking. They tuned it so that you can essentially do one-pedal driving with it, which is something, I've said before when I've drove the Bolt and some other cars, something I actually really like in EVs. And it's great for city driving. Because when you're in stop and go traffic, you don't have to constantly move your foot back and forth between the accelerator and brake. You just modulate one pedal, and it's a much more relaxing feel, and I really like that. And unlike some of the other EVs that are out there, like the Bolt and like the Nissan Leaf, the current generation Nissan Leaf, there is no option for a light regen mode. You get heavy regen, and that's it. It's BMW's way or the highway, which is fascinating. But it works. You
have to gotta respect that, right?
I like it a lot. I really do like this car. I think the only thing that I think that's a little lacking about it, always has been the range. Has been on the short side. And I think for its price point. Especially, it's getting better now with the new version that's going to have a 150-mile range, but it's not the greatest range. But for something you're going to drive primarily around town, as an urban vehicle, it makes a lot of sense, and it just works really well.
Right. If you're putting on 150 miles in an urban setting, that's a lot. That's more than a day's worth of driving. If you're doing that much, you're a commercial driver.
Yep.
And that's so maybe the i3 is not the right car for you in that setting. But it's not just the battery too. Like, it sounds like one of the ways they're boosting range with the i3 is increasing the size of the battery pack, and as battery technology gets more power out of a smaller footprint, that'll continue to improve. But also, the motor tech, I'm sure BMW is looking at that because, that's what they do with the gas engines too. I'm sure they're looking to continually push the motor tech to be more efficient, more powerful, all of those things that we like out of gas engines. Just now they need to do it out of the electric motors as well.
That's right, and also improving things like the power electronics efficiency, which that's what does the conversion between AC and DC as you go back and forth from the motor to the battery, because the battery obviously stores direct current, and direct current motors are not as efficient as alternating current, so that's what they use on the motors. And so you have that going that back and forth, and there's always some losses in that conversion, and so. As power electronics systems get better, then that improves the overall efficiency, and that's one of the advantages that is one of the things that Tesla has really done very well with their vehicles is their power electronics design is very efficient, and so that gives them some advantages that other manufacturers don't have.
Yeah, as those other manufacturers enter the market more. They become more committed to it. That's going to be interesting to watch, because those are the areas where you can get immediate improvement. You don't have to wait for the battery miracle to happen. That,
exactly.
May or may not. You've got to fix the things that you can fix right now. So those are going to be the things where we see breakthroughs. I think That's my prediction anyway. So all right, so the i3 gets a positive rating from you for tooling around in the city.
And it's actually the second EV in a row that I've been driving, because before I left for this West Coast trip, I was driving around Michigan in the Hyundai Ioniq Electric, which is one of the 3 different variants of the Ioniq that are currently available. And you can't actually buy one in Michigan, but they had one in the press fleet, and so. This is the battery electric version, and Hyundai, with the Ioniq, when they developed the Ioniq, it was before they knew about cars like the Bolt and longer range version of the Leaf that's coming, and they decided to optimize it for efficiency, and so as a result, they went with a smaller, lighter battery pack. It's only a 27 kilowatt hour battery pack. It gives them about 124 mile range, and with that, it's actually one of the most efficient EVs you can get right now. But again, like this i3, it's going to be limited in the use cases that it's good for. But
but that's a lot of range out of a good. Yeah, that's a lot of range out of a battery that size too.
Especially just sort of live in California where you're not using the heater all the time and things like that. It works very well for those kinds of applications. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's got to be the best version of the Ioniq. I think that when you take a car and you make it electric, it becomes great. When you make it a hybrid, it's less great. When you make it gas, it's great. But so it's like this automotive horseshoe theory.
The plug-in hybrid version of the Ioniq is actually pretty good too. It gives you most of the benefit of the hybrid of the battery electric, but it also gives you that extra flexibility for driving wherever, whenever you want to, without having to plan so much for charging. It's got 27 miles of electric range, which is is enough for most people's daily urban commute or suburban commute for that matter, and then it just keeps on going as a hybrid after that.
Well, and we've talked about how the kind of range anxiety thing is largely solved and largely just an opinion or like a phobia versus an actual problem for many car drivers. But that's something that the plug-in hybrids solve pretty well, and they give you mostly electric if your commute is within sort of the parameters of that normal everyday commute. So that's a plus. But just a pure electric I'm always shocked at how serene that experience is. I mean, I'm sure you're in the i3 right now. It's quiet,
Yeah,
it's just sort of calm.
Incredibly quiet. I do miss the sound of a good engine, but the reality is most cars don't have great engines anyway. So in most cars, most mainstream cars that you drive, you're not missing anything. It's only when you're driving performance cars. But when I'm commuting, I'm not going to be taking advantage of that anyway, so it doesn't bother me that much.
You can just connect your phone via Bluetooth and play recordings of car sounds.
Yeah, you can play a recording of an M5 while you're driving the i3.
Yeah, that works. I mean, it's BMW. Don't they do that anyway?
Synthetic anyway,
That's right. It's the M5 synth patch.
Yeah.
So I stayed all gas over the last couple of weeks. Right now I'm in a Lexus LS500 F Sport, which is a lovely update of the classic LS, recipe. It looks really good. It has that
fantastic.
modern, has that modern Lexus sort of design language. It's just really, really sharp. It does have the big grille, but it works here. Overall, this is a nice big sedan. The aircraft carrier size 4-door, and the interior design is fantastic. I love the interior design. The F Sport has sort of like metal inserts on the doors or around the door handles, and each of the armrests kind of floats and they're backlit. There's a lot of drama visually in the car. There's a set of like metal ribbing on the dashboard all the way across that makes up the vents. It looks like an old, like hi-fi audio component. It's really, really pretty, and it's not anything that is like old or traditional. It's definitely something that they came up with this century. It's nice in that sense. The engine is plenty powerful. It does not have a problem getting out of its own way. It's the first LS I've driven that's not really terribly floaty or just sort of doesn't feel like it wants to play along. Like right now I'm driving in eco mode because we're podcasting and I don't want to get ahead of myself. But you can put it in Sport or Sport Plus. It has those modes, and it gets a little bit more aggressive in how it responds. Although at the end of the day, it's still an LS, so there's still, throttle tip in is kind of soft, and if you want to be playing racer, get an IS and have fun with it. But the LC Coupes. I mean, Lexus is just they've hit a stride over the last few years where the design language has really come together. The cars are really beautiful. They're clearly well put together, and they drive well. They're infusing their cars. They're doing what Toyota's doing as well as just putting some more passion back in the cars. And this is it's a gray car on the outside, but it's got this lovely red seats, and so there's some spirit here. It's not trying to blend in too much, and I really love that, because I think that's one of the things that Lexus was dinged for so long for being overly conservative or just, I don't want to say bland, but just so highly refined that they don't really get your blood flowing enough, and this is not that kind of car. It's a car that makes a visual statement. It's a car that makes a performance statement, and that's fantastic to see from Lexus. One of the things that gets my I don't want to say adrenaline, but it gets my blood flowing in the wrong way. is they've come up with a new control scheme, because every auto company does this now. So instead of their little remote touch interface mouse thing, they've got a pad now. And this is the first Lexus I've used that has this. And so you've got to do a lot of swiping to get back and forth around the infotainment system. And it can be really tedious for simple things. Like, it definitely keeps the button count down, but to get back and forth between, say, the phone or the nav and like climate adjustments and just to turn seat heaters on and stuff like that, it takes an inordinate amount of just like swiping and scrolling and clicking with this thing. It's very distracting, and I don't like it at all. I will try the voice commands and see if that smooths things out. But again, like it's really hard to do this and do it well. And BMW is one of the few that has been at it long enough that they've gotten over everybody hating their system and they've fixed it to a large degree. Lexus isn't there yet, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I've driven several vehicles with that touchpad, several Lexus vehicles with that touchpad system, and it's a terrible interface. I actually kind of liked the previous one, that was the stubby mouse-like joystick thing. Once you got used to how it works, it was actually pretty good. I like the haptic feedback that it provided, and the trackpad also provides haptic feedback. But because, like you said, you have to keep swiping around, it's a relative motion rather than it's different from the system that Acura put in the new RDX, which is an absolute touch system. So wherever you touch it, corresponds to the same location on the screen. Whereas this is more like a computer trackpad, but it's less precise. If you've ever used a Mac, a MacBook, they have the best trackpads in the business, and they track really well and have great resolution. Most Windows machines are not nearly as good, and the Lexus trackpad is far worse than any computer I've used.
Yeah, it's very unresponsive. It takes a lot of swipes, and because it sticks, you can have 3 different things going on in the screen from left, center, and right. So to get back and forth between those, sometimes you got to give it a little extra nudge or a larger swipe or something, and it won't go. And you're trying to do this while you're driving. It's one thing when you're stopped, but yeah, it's really. I hope that they redo this soon, because it really does mar an otherwise fantastic car. This is S-Class 7 Series kind of competition that you're looking at, and those cars, I don't really like Command as much, but those cars do it better, and that's the kind of stuff that is the deciding factor now in this class of car. They all drive well in their own right. They're slightly different. The LS500 certainly feels lighter on its feet than the last BMW or Mercedes of this class that I tried. So I'm impressed with that too. It feels like a proper sedan that can be wrung out a bit. So it's just fascinating to see where Lexus has gone. They used to have better tech than the Germans in some way, and now, or at least more reliable tech, and now it's kind of the other way around. Easier to use stuff and iDrive is not unsophisticated. Especially when you get into a 7 Series, you can have different temperatures coming out of all the vents and stuff. It gets to be super intricate. So for the LS, I was in the new Forester too, the new Subaru Forester. That thing, have you driven it?
I have not yet driven it. No. What'd you think?
My goodness. It's so good. It's solid. It's really refined. It's quiet. They did a fantastic job updating the Forester, because the Forester I wouldn't say there were rough edges, but it had that Subaru personality. And it still has some of that Subaru.
And it felt like something that came out of the forest, right?
Yeah, exactly. It kind of crawled out of the ooze. But it's really, really good. The 2-liter engine, I think it was 2-liter, and the CVT are plenty powerful. It moves with authority. It's the same kind of comments I had for the Ascent. I was just impressed how they got that much performance out of that small of a powertrain in both cases. And it feels really solid going down the road. It drives really well. It handles nicely. The all-wheel drive actually, you can feel it kind of kicking in and rotating you around corners if you know what you're you're looking for. So that's nice. It just it has that touch of WRX in it. And it looks good. It's well finished inside. All the things that we've consistently complained about for Subarus, they have figured out now how to make those go away. The Forester, I couldn't find a flaw in it. It's just that good, and I was very impressed with it.
Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah,
you can never have too many really good products in this segment.
No. Well, and Subaru has been growing so aggressively too. They have to almost put out really bigger steps now, I guess, in larger increments. They have to improve more with every generation, or because they're a small manufacturer, their lead's going to get nibbled. They've been growing at a very fast pace over the last few years. So, got to do something to maintain that edge.
That's right.
It's great. I really liked it quite a bit, and to the point where I was so impressed with the CVT and how it amplifies the torque of that engine and is nice and smooth. It's generally not buzzy like CVT. It doesn't do that motorboat thing much.
Right. Yeah. So do they do like a Nissan style control where it kind of simulates a conventional transmission, or does it just do more gradual, type of keeping it within the optimal range?
Oh, so usually it's just nice and smooth, and it changes ratios without any kind of steps or anything, and you don't notice it. When you do something like merging or accelerate hard, it's going to it'll rev up and then it'll just ratchet back a few hundred RPM, and it'll do that to simulate gear shifts. And the only time you feel that is when you're driving a little bit more aggressively. Other than that, it's just quiet and smooth.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on to some topics.
All right, so one of the things we've been accused of is hating on Tesla, and while we don't hate them, there's certainly problems that we've pointed out that restrict their ability to turn a profit. And Sandy Munro and Munro Associates also pointed out some of those issues. They had a Tesla or two that they tore down, and they looked at how it's built, Model 3 specifically. They looked at how it's built from all different angles, just the body structure and the power electronics like we were talking about earlier, and the motors themselves. And they came to a few conclusions. And one of the conclusions that was really interesting to me is that the potential for profit with the Model 3 is really high. And who knows if they're meeting it, but they could actually make quite a bit of profit off this car if they could sort out some of the problems. I'm going to hand it over to you because you probably understand a lot of these issues way better than I do.
Yeah, so, their original report that they published a few months ago, where they talked about that potential for profit was largely based on, their analysis of the bill of materials, the parts going into it, how much the cost of the components was relative to the sales price of the car. And based solely on that, they estimated, I think, like a 29% potential 29% profit margin on the thing. But the problem in the car business, as well as in most businesses, is it's never quite as simple as that. And they've continued doing their analysis, additional analysis after they finished that report, and did some more detailed looks at some of the components. And what they have come out with an update on that original report, and they looked at some of the things like how the body structure is put together, and that they based on that assessment they realized that Tesla is actually missing out on a lot of the potential profit that might be available in this vehicle because of the way they're building it. One particular highlight that was in the wheel wells. If you look at most modern vehicles, wow, there's this drone buzzing overhead right now. Anyway, if you look at, sorry, got distracted there for a moment.
They're watching you.
Yeah, if you look at most modern vehicles from mainstream manufacturers, you'll find that one of the things that they've learned how to do over the last 15, 20 years is really do a lot more integration of components and reduce the total number of parts that have to go together, particularly in the body structure and the body panels. So on a lot of cars now, you'll see that like the full body side of the car will be stamped as one single piece.
Right. So that's a more modern thing too. Like that just started in the 90s.
Yeah,
where you had
actually in many cases even in the 2000s. So basically the entire body side from the front fenders to the tail lights will be stamped as a single piece of steel. So you don't have to join all these parts and get them all lined up and weld them and braze them, to get it all nice and smooth. It's just one piece that attaches to the understructure.
And it makes cars nice and rigid.
It makes them nice and rigid, makes them more, gives you more consistent quality, better finish on the panels, and that rigidity also means that you have, that it's quieter, you have better NVH, and there's less places, for example, to get corrosion, because every time you're joining panels, those are potential corrosion points, and I'm
sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, what Munro found, when they continued their analysis is looking at, they highlighted, in the wheel wells, where there's multiple individual pieces of metal that are welded together and spot welded and riveted together, and this is just an insane way to build this thing.
Yeah, I saw that. I was like, there's like 8 pieces in the wheelhouse, and it just looked like they built it from scraps they had laying around. I was astounded by that, because that's, like you said, that's usually a single stamping.
Yeah, and that adds to the manufacturing complexity. It makes it harder to get consistent fit and finish on it, and especially with what Tesla was trying to do with trying to automate as much of the production process as possible. That makes it a lot harder to do that when you have so many individual little pieces. If you can reduce the number of pieces you have to join together, it makes it a lot easier to automate those processes.
So how does that happen, though? Like, Tesla definitely has people on staff that were, tasked with designing the body and making it, mass production ready. It seems like something went awry there, though, that either the person they had doing that or the team they had doing that wasn't up to the task, or some other reason for the way it is. How does that happen?
It's hard to say without being on the inside and knowing, what really went, who made what decisions. But given, Elon Musk's propensity for control and micromanaging, you've got to assume that a lot of it was based on decisions that came from him, and trying to respond to things that he was demanding, and it turned out that this was the only way they could do it, and also hit their timelines. Because one of the things about doing it in the way that I described, where it's a more integrated approach, is that it actually it takes more time up front to do that. There's a lot of engineering effort required to do all the analysis of those various components and really understand how it's all going to come together, and designing the dies for stamping those parts is a more complex process. So that means that your initial product development time is going to be a little bit longer, but then once you get there, once you've done all that work, then it's actually a lot easier to build it. So you can build it with greater consistency, but you have to make that upfront investment. And if you look at what Tesla did in the course of developing the Model 3, they seem to rush through a lot of the steps that you would normally do in a development process. And as a result, I think what happened was, perhaps because of the compressed timeline that Musk put on him, and said, we've got to have this car in production by by the end of 2017 or the middle of 2017. And I think that there just wasn't time for them to do that proper engineering, to do the work required to actually achieve what needed to be done. And so they kind of had to, do this ad hoc approach of putting it together.
Yeah, well, there's the guy out here in Massachusetts who is sort of the rogue Tesla mechanic. I forget his name off the top of my head, but one of the things that he has said is that every car he's taken apart has been different. And he's basically rebuilding Model S's, and so that's really that's a line that's been up and running for a while now. They shouldn't be different really at all.
Yeah, and this is a problem that the auto industry had back in the early 20th century when it was still young, when we were just learning how to build cars. It's like all the parts. We didn't have standardization of parts, and a lot of the parts were handmade. And if you had to get your car serviced, in 1910, then you had to. Oftentimes the parts had to be custom made or custom fit to a particular car, because you couldn't just take another part, off another car and swap them around. And this was a breakthrough that Henry Leland, the founder of Cadillac, made. I think it was in 1912.
1912, they won the trophy because that's the standard of the world. That's where that came from. Yeah,
exactly. The breakthrough that he made was, in how they manufacture parts and standardizing parts manufacturing so that every part was the same. And to demonstrate, that what they were doing, they actually took, I think, 2 or 3 Cadillacs and tore them completely down, to all the component parts, mixed up all the parts, and then put them back together, and they all worked. And that was the key to demonstrating the viability of this concept. And ever since then, this is what every mass manufacturer has done. And if you're trying to mass manufacture cars and no two cars are the same, and you're constantly making changes to them, this is one of the reasons why manufacturers try to minimize the number of running changes that they do to vehicles when they're in production. This is one of the things that Tesla has touted is, we don't wait for model years to make updates, to make changes in the cars. As soon as something's ready, we go ahead and we roll it out into production, which up to a point is fine, if you're doing relatively few cars. But if you're trying to mass manufacture cars for the mainstream market, that's not really a very good way to do it, because now, you never know, on any given, because you don't know what model year is or when in a model year something was built, you don't necessarily know what parts need to go on there. And this, I think, is one of the things that's contributed to the problems that they've had with providing service parts. If you go to, if your car needs to be fixed and you take it to a Tesla service center, oftentimes you'll be waiting weeks or months for parts because they don't know what has to go on there, and then trying to get the right parts, is just a complete nightmare from the factory.
These seem like basic things that should have been considered, and they should know this. They should have this down. They had the Roadster, they had the Model S, they had the Model X. Now we're into the Model 3. They're 4 models in. This is not stuff that they should be learning. Do you think some of these frustrations led to who did they just lose? They just lost their head of
their VP of manufacturing, Gilbert Passon, I think was his name.
So did he leave because he was frustrated, or?
They don't say. They declined to comment on personnel matters, other than acknowledging that yes, he did leave. So we don't know if he quit or was fired. What we do know is he actually came to Tesla from Toyota in 2010. So I don't know his full work history, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was on staff at NUMMI, which is the Tesla Fremont factory. Before Tesla got it from Toyota, it was the NUMMI factory where they built. It was the joint venture with General Motors where they built various iterations of Corolla and Pontiac Vibe and Chevy Nova and a few others over the years. And that was part of the purpose of that joint venture was for GM to learn the Toyota manufacturing system, lean manufacturing. And
they did.
Yeah. Oh, they definitely did.
And it seems like that was one of the other things that stood out in I think it was a Bloomberg article I just read about the Munro teardown. they've got like 10,000 people, and Tesla does, at that NUMMI facility, or that Fremont facility. And that's about twice as many as ever worked there in the NUMMI days, and Fremont before that, when it was probably one of the worst plants in GM's roster. You would think that they'd
under NUMMI, it had about 4,500 employees building cars there.
Right. So you would think that they've got people there. They don't have a problem throwing people at the problem. The problem is that manufacturing people aren't going to be able to solve the problems they should have thrown engineering people at and engineering hours at. It seems like that's the issue. There's a lot of people there, but the cars themselves are not designed well enough to go together. The body gaps and stuff like that. That all speaks to just like there's just fundamental issues there. And I thought, that's the problem. And Munro, Sandy Munro zeroed in on that too. He said this body is killing them.
Yeah, because there's a lot of other things that they do really well. The power electronics and their motor design are very good. They're state of the art. Not necessarily hugely better than everybody else, but they're absolutely among the best out there. And if you can't build a good body to put those parts into, then you're going to end up losing.
Yeah, he did say. I think the quote that stood out to me about the motor was like everybody should be benchmarking it. It's that good. It's light, it's powerful, it's efficient, and the way they spread the electronics throughout the car or on various modules, it's something that you see more in like consumer goods, and that's a Silicon Valley thing that actually works well. We bag on Silicon Valley for their hubris and their arrogance sometimes, but there are things you can learn from those guys, and the electrical and information architecture of the Model S apparently was pretty impressive.
Yeah, one of the other things that is distinct about the current Tesla products is Tesla was the first manufacturer to really go with a lot more centralized computing in the vehicle. Rather the traditional in most traditional cars, over time, as we've added new features like ABS and stability control and adaptive cruise control and lane keeping systems, all of these, have been added piecemeal to the vehicles, and they often come from different vendors. And so as a result, you have this, each one comes with its own electronic control unit and its own software, that they can talk to each other and they can share some information, but it's a much more complicated system. That's why you have 75 to 100 discrete computers in a modern car, but then they're not necessarily doing anything more than what you find in a traditional car or in a modern car. So you've got all these tiny little computers, whereas Tesla went with just a handful of more powerful computers, and consolidated everything. And that's the direction that manufacturers are going with next generation vehicles, is that domain controller architecture, with more centralized computing. But it's going to take a while to get there. And
I wonder if some of that, having individual modules that have the electronics in them, or the control units in them, the old way, is kind of a holdover from a design for production standpoint, right? Like you're sourcing your ABS modules from Bendix. Your fuel injection system comes from Bosch or from Regina, and those go together. You can have either or in the car. You could have a Bendix ABS, or you could have Continental ABS. At the end of the day, they both fit where they're supposed to fit, and they do the ABS job. But you got two different suppliers, and you don't have a problem with logistics or slowing down your line because you've got that one supplier who can't get you the part. And I wonder if that's sort of why other manufacturers have been a little slower to go that way, where Tesla, their logistics chain is clearly a little bit different, and the way that they have dealt with suppliers is also different, and seem to be a little bit more committed. They don't seem to have as much of an issue. If they're going to have one supplier for something, that's okay. That's the one supplier that makes a thing perfectly the way they want.
Yeah, it's that's part of it, but you typically don't find a lot of dual sourcing of those sorts of systems. It's more the commodity parts. Like the nuts and bolts, the electronically controlled stuff. You typically don't have dual sourced on any particular vehicle platform. It's usually just going to be one vendor. But certainly, the systems are designed that way. But actually, when you talk about design for manufacturing, that actually kind of runs counter to that argument, because when you do have all of the stuff scattered all over the car, it does make the electrical architecture more complex. The wiring harnesses are going to be more complex because you've got to run power to more different places and things like that. And finding places to package all these ECUs becomes more complex, whereas if you just have a couple of larger ECUs, it is easier to package. But what it does do is it gives manufacturers some flexibility in offering some of those features as options. And for customers that opt out of certain features, they don't install those parts in the car. And that's another area where that kind of hurts Tesla, because what they tend to do is just put everything in the car. So autopilot is being the prime example. They put the autopilot hardware in every single car they build. And then, it's up to the consumer to decide, do I want to pay the $5,000 for autopilot, or $8,000 if I want, full self-driving someday, maybe, possibly never. Tesla has already sunk that cost into the car without knowing whether they're going to get revenue from any given customer. And
so how different is the autopilot, hardware versus a non-autopilot car, right? Like there's not a ton of difference these days, right, between what the base model is going to have and what the autopilot is at that point, right? You've got some ABS actuators and electric steering.
The actuation system's going to be, at least in Tesla's case, is the same, because they don't include any of the redundancy that you should really be building in with those kind of systems. But that's a whole other story. They kind of do it on the cheap. So you've got 8 cameras in there as opposed to 1 that you would find in most cars, but there's still only 1 radar. But there is a more powerful computer, significantly more powerful than what you'll typically find, for running the stability control or adaptive cruise control systems on most vehicles. It's an NVIDIA powered system, which works really well, to the degree, up to a point, but it's actually not powerful enough to do a full self-driving system, and NVIDIA will tell you that. So that's why Tesla has already upgraded it once. They did an upgrade last year when they launched the Model 3 and went to a more powerful one. So when they launched Autopilot version 2 in 2016, they said this is going to be all the hardware we're ever going to need to do full self-driving, and it was a lie then, and it's still a lie, because they've already upgraded it once, and they're going to upgrade it again before they do, with their own in-house developed system, if and when they ever launch full self-driving.
So I guess the only positive I can see from making every car have the same stuff and just turn it on with the software switch is that you have reduced production variants. They're all the most expensive.
In theory, at least, yes, that is true. Yeah. You have reduced the number of buildable combinations. But, the unfortunate thing is, despite doing that, they still can't seem to reduce the actual variability in their build quality. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting to watch. I do hope that they get it together. I didn't know that the guy who left had been with Toyota, because if there's anything that could help Tesla right now, is a good dose of the Toyota way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
all right. Something that's more in your ballpark.
Yeah, I was gonna say let's move on. Let's crap on someone else. So I thought this was interesting. The news came out, I guess it was last week, that Ford has decided to shift away from its long-serving agency WPP, and they've moved some of their business.
That's ad agency for those that don't follow this stuff very closely.
Come on, why would nobody follow this stuff? This is the most fascinating thing. Agency people, we're wonderful. But anyway, right before they announced this, they also announced a new campaign that is called, I believe it's Ford Proud, which, I was a little skeptical of, but it sounds like it's going to be, it's not just like cynically sort of hanging their hat on Americana and the sort of Boston Strong or the sort of slogans that come out of disastrous and terrible events, and that was what I immediately thought. It sounds like this is going to be something different, but what it really points out to me is that automakers and the agencies that they use to try to like get people interested in their cars, so there's two things going on. They don't know how to sell the cars anymore, how to advertise the cars anymore, and they're not quite sure where their customers are going to come from. In the near future, it's okay, but as everybody talks, Ford themselves, Jim Hackett said, like, well, we're a mobility company. What the hell does that mean? And how do you advertise that?
Yeah, I mean that's a real challenge, to communicate those kinds of messages to average consumers that, for the foreseeable future at least, are still, looking to buy vehicles, whether it's cars or utilities or pickup trucks, to get them to work, to school, to the grocery store, wherever they need to go. They just want to know what's the best car or the best vehicle to buy for my needs, that I can actually afford.
Yeah, and cars now are also they're not exactly affordable. There's certainly you get a lot more value for your dollar than you used to, even though unless you inflation adjust the money, that's not really clear. With the average car edging up towards over $30,000 now, I think. But
yeah, the average transaction price is about $35,000 now.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. But yeah, you do get a lot. If you look at what you get for the money and you compare it even to 2000 or 1990, you're definitely getting more for less money. But it's still it's a lot to come up with. But that's in combination with all of the other costs that a lot of consumers have now. You've got the baby boom generation, which still has tremendous buying power, but they're starting to age out where some of them are already buying the last car they're ever going to buy. So you can't count on that huge generation for that much longer. You've got everybody in the middle that, they'll be reliable consumers when they have to be. But there may be some lag time because the cars last for 12 years now, roughly, too. So then you've got this other generation coming up, younger folks who are, say, 30 and under. And they're a very large generation as well. They just don't have the buying power yet. And so automakers are trying to figure out how to get those dollars when those people do have buying power. And at the same time as we're shifting away possibly from the idea of private car ownership. Autonomous vehicles are a very popular subject. And are we going to have privately owned vehicles by the time these people are ready to spend $40,000 on the car? We don't know. And I honestly don't think we're going to have autonomous vehicles anytime soon, at least not in a personally owned space. But all of those messages, you have to boil those down, and just watching car advertising it's just a mess. What's the last car ad you can remember?
Well, since I cut the cord several years ago, I don't really see car ads anymore.
Right. I'm kind of in the same boat.
Most of the time, when I see car ads, it's usually when I've gotten email notifications from from the PR people about here's our Super Bowl ad, right. Please write a story about it, and right. So I may go take a look at it on YouTube, and that's where, if I see car ads, that's usually where I see them, is on YouTube.
Yeah, and that's such a different beast, especially the Super Bowl ads. Those are flagships. Those don't necessarily actually need to convert and turn customers, turn viewers into customers. Those are branding exercises.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say that that's the interesting thing. You mentioned the Ford Proud thing, and that's not really about promoting a particular nameplate. There's this distinction. There's these two different kinds of ads. You've got the product ads, where they're trying to sell you a specific product, and these brand ads where they're trying to build brand awareness, trying to create an image or something around the brand, and those are very distinctly different kinds of ads.
Yeah, and I think that's what Ford Proud is intended to do, especially if you've taken a look at Ford's share price lately. Everybody's taken a shellacking, especially with the tariffs starting to bite on their materials costs. It just basically sucked $1 billion out of automakers over the last quarter. So Ford wants to be the company you think of when you think of a car or a mobility solution or something, and that's what I think Ford Proud is going to be. And I'm a little skeptical just because of my opinion about car advertising, but and my opinion about what WPP in the past and J. Walter Thompson, which was Ford's flagship agency for a long time, has done. I just like car ads are abysmal because the best car ads happened at a time that was so much different than now, and again, like best car ads are also kind of an opinion. So we're in a different place, but it's much harder because the audience is so stratified to actually, push through and make an impression. So I will reserve judgment on that, but it's just fascinating to watch what Ford is trying to do, because they're trying to get out ahead of just making sure that people think of Ford, because they need you to think of Ford. And from your time inside agencies, or an agency working for automaker PR too, like you got a lot of different people trying to get a lot of different messages out there, and usually there's that like one ad that they're trying to put all of those into. That's difficult.
Yeah, no, it's a real challenge, and I've sat in, I had the unfortunate opportunity to sit in a few meetings where there were some of these discussions going on, about the messaging, or I both being when I was on the PR side and also as a journalist, oftentimes, when we go in for a preview of a new product, one of the, part of the presentation will be bringing out the marketing team, to talk about here's who we're trying to sell this vehicle, who we developed this vehicle for. Here is our target customer, and it's like, who the hell is that person? It's like I have no idea what you're talking about. It's completely mystifying. So, sitting in some of these sessions, when the marketing people are trying to explain, who this vehicle's for and how they plan to promote it, seeing the themes that they put up there, the various random images that have nothing to do, that don't seem to have anything to do with the specific product. It's a weird process that they go through, and it's definitely something that's not really in my bailiwick. But it's it'll be interesting to watch, in the coming years, as not just Ford but every manufacturer, I think, are increasingly going to struggle with how they get their messaging across about what their brand represents and what their who their products are for. Yeah, it is weird, and there's a lot of mumbo jumbo and a lot of justification of existence. And the side of the advertising industry that I work in is a little bit more mercenary than that. We try to be very cost efficient, and every dollar we spend, we want to try to track it and bring it back to an actual closed sale, if you will, a completed transaction. And that's not necessarily the goal of these branding exercises and stuff. So I watch with a little skepticism. Anyway, now that we've completely bored everyone, you said you had a talk that you wanted to tack on to the end. Yeah, so just a little background. I was invited to the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti Regional Chamber is doing a series over the course of the next year, as they celebrate their centennial, and they're going to be doing these sessions on a quarterly basis, and they invited me in for the first one to do a little talk, and this is to non-automotive people, to talk about the future of mobility and try to provide some grounding on what's the reality of the mobility future. And so talked for about a half hour. And I will also I'll put on the post there will be a link to the slide deck. So if you want to follow along a little bit and see what I had to say, and let us know what you think.
All right. Well, I think that's the podcast. I mean, you're probably at the airport, and I'm almost home.
Close to it.
See, we should do this from the car more often. If I took public transit, I'd have a lot of people looking at me like I'm a weirdo.
Yeah, well, they do that anyway.
That's true. That is true. So, all right, well, you can find us at Wheelbearings Cast on Twitter. No vowels except for the A in cast. I am Boston_Auto. You are Sam Aboyle Samid. We also have the Facebook. There's our email. There's a variety of ways to get our attention. So please do leave us some reviews in Apple Podcasts or whatever podcatcher you use, and you can find us in all of them if you look in Pocket Casts or Overcast or Apple Podcasts or even in Spotify now. If you just search for Wheelbearings in Spotify, you will find the Wheelbearings podcast in there if that's your chosen method of listening to podcasts. So whatever you do, go listen and let us know what you think, and we'll see everybody next week. Just wanted to give a shout out to some of the various people that at the events I've been to in the past week that have mentioned that they are listeners. Some of the folks at Toyota, like JB and Eugene at the TU Automotive Conference I was at earlier this week, that mentioned that they listened to the show. Keep listening, and send us a note. Let us know what you think. And if you are a listener and you happen to be at some event where I'm doing a panel or speaking or something, come on up and say hi. Yeah, and I don't ever go to events or panels. I go weird places like the hills around Aberdeen, Washington, where there's no cell signal and I get 2 flat tires. But that's a story for another time. Yeah. All right, so we'll catch everybody next week. All right, bye.
Thank you again to Bob, to everyone here at Toyota, and let's get started here with our mobility future. Our first presenter is Sam Aboyle, who is Senior Analyst for Navigant Research's Transportation Efficiency Program. He leads there the Mobility Research Service.
Thank you.
Sam is a foremost expert in terms of this content, and that's really because of his unique background. He has 20 years experience in terms of automotive engineering. He worked in product technology, communications for both Ford and GM, and he's been a widely published and consulted auto journalist. So basically, Sam actually understands the technical components of what we're talking about and can communicate that in a way that is easily understood. That is a hard skill set. So we are very fortunate to have Sam here with us, and because of his background, he is really the right person to set the baseline for our mobility future, to tell us what's real, what's coming, what's theory and potential, what's myth, what's going to happen, and give us a sense. So here to kick off our mobility future, please welcome Sam Aboyle. Thank you.
So if you've been paying attention to the media in the last few years, you've probably heard about autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles or self-driving cars. And you may think that they've sprung up out of whole cloth in the last 4 or 5 years, perhaps even sprung up out of the mind of Elon Musk. But in fact, it's not exactly the case. The idea of the automated vehicle has actually been around for many decades. Back in 1956, General Motors revealed this concept car called the Firebird 2, and there's a video that if you look online on YouTube, you can find about an 8-minute promotional film that GM did back then, demonstrating this vehicle being used by a family in an automated mode, handing off control to a remote control operator somewhere, and going into an autonomous mode for a road trip. Unfortunately, the technology was not really ready to do that, and it actually hasn't been ready until really just the last few years. But about a dozen years ago, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, launched the Grand Challenge program, actually about 15 years ago, trying to get companies and academics and so on to develop automated driving technologies as part of the response to what was going on in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They wanted to get automated vehicles to replace having to have humans driving vehicles through dangerous zones where there were IEDs and everything. And the result of that program was 3 competitions over the course of 4 years that culminated in the 2007 Urban Challenge that was held in Victorville, California. That one, after the original Desert Challenge, was won by a team from Stanford with assistance from Volkswagen with a VW Touareg. In the Urban Challenge, the team from Carnegie Mellon University with support from General Motors went on to win that in 2007. And this was actually the first automated vehicle that I ever actually had a chance to ride in back in January 2008. So I've had the chance to ride in a lot of different automated vehicles over the past dozen years. And it's amazing how far things have come, and I'll come back to that in a second. 3 years later, at the Shanghai World Expo, GM showed this little pod called the NB. And it was designed as an urban autonomous mobility vehicle, NV standing for electric network vehicle. The idea was that people living in dense urban cores could use a smartphone app to summon one of these vehicles when they need a ride and take them wherever they needed to go and hop out, and the vehicle would go on to pick up somebody else. And this is kind of the inspiration for what came later from the Google self-driving project with their little pod cars that you may have seen as well. And then now today we have vehicles like this one. This is a modified Chevrolet Bolt. That's one of the development vehicles being used by GM's subsidiary Cruise Automation to develop automated driving technology for production. And the plan is for this vehicle to be deployed commercially in 2019 in San Francisco for automated mobility services, automated ride-hailing services. The technology behind all of this is actually far more complex than most people realize. Let me give you a little bit of quick background here on what the levels are. You may have heard of various levels of automation that have been defined by the Society of Automotive Engineers. Level 0 are vehicles of the type that we drove up until fairly recently that had no real automation at all. They were completely manual. The driver was responsible for everything. Level 1 are vehicles that are actually becoming quite commonplace today. Most of Toyota's new vehicles, vehicles from most other manufacturers are increasingly incorporating level 1 capabilities as standard equipment. Level 1 means that you've got advanced driver assist features like adaptive cruise control that uses a radar sensor to track the distance of the vehicle ahead of you, automatic lane keeping systems, blind spot monitors, and so on. But each one of those systems function independently of each other. They often come from different suppliers, and they don't coordinate amongst each other within the vehicle. Level 2 is when you start to bring these systems together, and this is what we call partial automation. And this is systems like Tesla's Autopilot, GM's Super Cruise, which is in the picture here, that combine steering control and acceleration and braking control. The GM system is the first one on the market that actually officially lets you go completely hands-off when you're on divided highways. So when you engage the system, when it detects that you're in the middle of the lane, it gives you a signal, you can take your hands off and just sit back. You still have to watch the road, though. So this is what we call a hands-off, eyes-on, brain-on system. The next step are things like the traffic jam pilot system that Audi announced last year on their new A8. It's not actually in production yet, but hopefully in 2019 it will be. This is a system that takes the next step forward, what we call conditional automation, that allows the driver to go brain off. So you're not paying attention anymore. You can do other things. But you still have to be awake and ready to take over because there's going to be situations where the system cannot function properly because of its limitations. And then level 4 automation is what you see from vehicles like Waymo's self-driving minivans, that Cruise Bolt that I showed you a moment ago, and many others that are being developed by a wide variety of companies. And these are systems we call highly automated vehicles that are capable of operating completely without human intervention, but within a limited operating domain. These are the vehicles, when we start to see automated vehicles in the next few years, this is what you're going to see the most of. These vehicles are capable of being fully automated, but they cannot operate everywhere. And in fact, there are most places they will not be able to operate probably for many years to come. What we call level 5, full self-driving vehicles, will eventually get here. Those are vehicles where you have the same functionality as level 4, except they can function everywhere under all weather conditions. And what we're seeing right now is the transition from, in the DARPA days and the last 7 or 8 years, going from research projects for automated driving to full production engineering. And that means that they have to deal with problems like working in bad weather. When they did the DARPA project, it was in good weather conditions. It was operating in Southern California. There was no snow, no rain. It's the same reason why you see most of the automated driving development going on in California and Arizona and Nevada, because they don't have any weather. When you have a vehicle that has adaptive cruise control, like this Hyundai, when you drive in wintertime, that radar sensor can get covered up with slush, and it suddenly becomes inoperative. That's not an acceptable situation for an automated vehicle. Your cameras get covered with snow, or they get covered with dust if you're driving in the desert. Those are not acceptable situations for a vehicle that's supposed to be capable of operating fully autonomously. So we've got manufacturers working on systems like this to keep the sensors clean. And this is actually on one of Waymo's vehicles. This is a system that they developed. Bird poop is one of those things that you're going to encounter in the real world. There's a difference between R&D and doing development testing and actually having to function daily, carrying people and carrying packages around. So there's still a lot of basic fundamental engineering work that everybody has to do. And that means that before we have automated vehicles that can take us anywhere we want to go, anytime, there's a lot more work that has to go into that to make it viable and really reliable and robust for day-to-day use. But when we do get there, which is probably going to start happening as we get into the mid to later 2020s, we're going to start seeing some transitions in the auto industry and in the business. And the overall number of vehicles on the road is probably going to peak sometime in the latter half of the 2020s globally. We're probably going to hit about 1.2 billion vehicles in total on the world's roads. And then it's going to start to decline as we start to see more and more use of automated mobility services, which is the line curve that you see overlapping the bar chart here. And in the latter half of the 2020s is when we expect to start seeing a real ramp up in use of automated mobility services as these automated vehicles become more reliable, more robust, able to operate in more conditions, and also more affordable so that the cost of the services come down. So our forecast at Navigant Research is by the mid-2020s we expect to see 4 to 6 million automated vehicles a year globally being deployed. In the early part of the 2020s, it's going to be starting in the next couple of years from the low tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands in the early 20s, and then accelerating up into the mid-20s and beyond. By the mid-30s, you expect to see about half of the world's vehicles at least be capable of level 4 automation and beyond, level 4 or level 5 automation. And as part of that, alongside that, we're seeing a transition already towards more and more use of ride-hailing services as one of the primary forms of mobility as a service, as we call it. And so, this is something that started happening about 7 or 8 years ago with Uber and then Lyft and now other companies like Grab and Didi Xuxing in China and Get and many others around the world. And what we're rapidly seeing, especially in urban centers, where it's already very expensive, very problematic to own an individual vehicle. More and more people, although it's still a tiny percentage of the total people that are traveling, but more and more people are using these sorts of ride-hailing services. And I'm sure probably most of you in this room have used either Uber or Lyft at some point in the last couple of years, if not on a regular basis, at least probably when you're traveling, instead of as an alternative to renting a car. And when in these urban centers, the need for automated or for mobility services is going to become more important as we continue the transition with urbanization globally. More and more people moving from rural areas or suburban areas into cities around the world. We have more and more megacities around the world. And a big part of that is going to be, a big chunk of that is going to be taken up by automated vehicles. We expect that most of the automated vehicles that are deployed in the coming decades are going to be deployed through these mobility services rather than sold to individual consumers. And there's a number of reasons for that. Primarily is affordability, but also liability concerns. The cost of this technology is still very high, and it's going to remain high, obviously higher than a conventional vehicle. But at the same time, there are a number of new costs that are coming along. It's not just the technology, but also a change in the way that the industry has to think about cars or vehicles. The traditional model for a manufacturer is you design and validate a vehicle, build it, sell it, and then forget it and move on to developing the next generation of that vehicle. So we haven't gotten into the habit of providing ongoing support and updates for the vehicles once they're sold. Manufacturers will sell some service parts over the life of the vehicle. They'll do compliance recalls. But until Tesla came along and started doing over-the-air updates and providing new functionality to vehicles while they were in service, that was not something that was traditionally done in the auto industry. And as we get into automated vehicles, that's something that is going to have to change. Because this is still maturing technology, it's evolving technology, and so manufacturers are going to have to provide service, functional updates for the life of that vehicle. More importantly, they're going to also have to provide security updates, because these vehicles are all going to be highly connected. And that means that there is going to be a significant risk associated with that. There's all kinds of things that can potentially happen. When you've got connectivity, there's an attack surface, and with any complex system, you can never guarantee absolute security. So there are going to be people that are going to try to attack these systems. And so the cost of that is going to require manufacturers there's a cost associated with providing those updates over the life of the vehicle. And that's going to cause issues with affordability for mainstream customers, because the cars are already getting very expensive. And if you're adding on these additional ongoing costs, you can either build it into the price up front or charge a subscription fee over the life of the car, neither of which is probably going to be an acceptable solution to most consumers. So that's going to drive manufacturers to deploying most of these vehicles through automated mobility services, except at the very high-end, very premium vehicles where customers might be willing to pay those costs directly. But for most of us, we'll be using automated vehicles through mobility services. And so that's going to mean that the number of drivers employed in these mobility services, while it's going to continue to grow for the next 5 to 10 years, as we get into the mid-2020s and beyond, it's going to start to decline pretty rapidly, because those services are going to increasingly be taken over by automated vehicles. But there will be new opportunities for other kinds of jobs associated with this, because those vehicles will require service. They're going to require cleaning. They're going to require sensor calibration. So there's going to be opportunities for new kinds of jobs. So as part of all this, though, it's not going to be just a straight-up transition from everybody owning their own vehicle, driving it to work, to school, wherever. There's going to be a mobility ecosystem. We're going to have these sorts of automated vehicles that you can hail a ride just as you do today, except there won't be a driver behind the wheel. But there's also going to be micro-mobility. There's going to be shared bikes, shared scooters. We also need to have various forms of mass transit, including intercity transit. You're still going to have airlines, you're going to have trains, and so on. But you're also, in cities, going to have shuttles. So some of these low-speed autonomous shuttles, like the Local Motors Ollie, the Navia Arma, which is actually now being built locally here down in Saline. Might someday even have something like a Hyperloop. It's being tested. We'll see whether the technology can actually scale affordably, but there's going to be various other types of transportation modes, and also even traditional modes like buses and subways. All of these are part of this ecosystem that we need to have, because we can't just throw mass fleets of automated vehicles on the road, because that's not going to address the problem of urban congestion. We need to try to right-size the transportation mode for every ride. When you're only going a few blocks, you don't need to take a car or a bus or a Hyperloop. You might be better off, depending on what the weather's like, taking a bike or a scooter. There's some very interesting comments recently from Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi, who talked about this. He said that for riders to wait 5 or 10 minutes for a car to take them 10 blocks makes no sense. It doesn't make sense for Uber economically. It doesn't make sense for cities. We're better off to use other forms of mobility for short trips like that. And then for longer high-density routes, again, mass transit still plays a great part. One of the issues that we've always had with mass transit is that it's costly to provide service to all parts of a community, especially when there tend to be certain routes that you have a lot of density. Those are cost-effective routes, but we also have a lot of areas of a city where there's not enough density to justify sending a full bus, and so we end up having either underutilized services or transit deserts. And so having a mixed mode, a multimodal ecosystem that provides a variety of different transportation options, so that and having platforms that can optimize every trip. So maybe what you have in the future is you have an app that you put down where you want to go, and it gives you the options available, and you can take the one that's going to get you there the fastest, or the cheapest, or the most efficiently. So there's going to be a variety of these, and we're already starting to see this happen. Recently, Reach Now, the mobility service division of BMW in Seattle, launched an updated version of their service. They had been doing a free-floating car share service in Seattle, and what they've done is they've now added ride-hailing as an option to that. And when you open up the new version of their app, as it would with Uber or Lyft, it shows your current location. You put in what your destination is, your desired destination, and then it gives you the options. It shows you can hail a ride, it'll get you there in 10 minutes, or you can walk 3 blocks and pick up a car, it'll get you there in 15 minutes. The car share will cost you $10, the ride hail will cost you $15, and you can choose what's the best option for you depending on how much time you have to your next appointment, how much you want to spend. You can pick the right one. And that sort of thing is going to expand to include all of these other modes going forward. So back to micromobility for a moment. This is something that's really exploded in the last 6 or 7 months. I was in San Jose in March for the NVIDIA GPU Technology Conference when Bird launched. On the second day of the conference, I walked out of the hotel to go to dinner, and all of a sudden there were scooters all over the sidewalk. And I had no idea nobody had any idea where these came from. They were completely unannounced. And I opened up my phone and looked up Bird scooters, and then I saw, what had happened, that they had just launched this service. And in principle, it's a great idea. But what we need to do is we need to coordinate it with all these other services. And there's also safety issues associated with this. If you've got people zooming up and down the sidewalks on scooters or on the streets, there's the potential for all kinds of havoc to happen, and people just leaving scooters, in the middle of the sidewalk. So maybe one of the things that we need to think about going forward is adding more protected bike lanes. And this actually has a number of potential benefits to them, because first of all, it provides an opportunity for bike and scooter riders to get off the sidewalk away from the pedestrians, and also keep them separate from road traffic. So now all of a sudden, you don't have pedestrians dodging scooters and vice versa, but it also, as we start to get into automated vehicles, having those protected lanes gives us the opportunity to also maybe physically separate the automated vehicles from the pedestrians and these scooters, and at least, especially in the early years of this, as the technology is still evolving, hopefully give us a safer environment for everybody to operate in. And also, as part of, perhaps doing a road diet, in a city, doing these protected lanes, can be a real benefit. I know certainly here in Washtenaw County, there's been a lot of road diets done in recent years. The street I used to live on until last year underwent a road diet a couple of years ago, and there's a huge benefit to doing that. So, the next step of the road diet is maybe adding these extra curbs to do protected lanes for the micromobility. But as part of the overall service scheme, there's going to be a wide variety of service models. You've got everything from today, we've got services like Turo that offer peer-to-peer car sharing, so anybody can rent their car, make their car available for other people to rent. You've got services like Tesla in Southern California that provide intercity services using Tesla vehicles. We've also got pilots starting now. Munro has a pilot program going on in Arizona with Kroger using this little autonomous pod that does not carry people. It's designed only to carry groceries. So, we're going to have a wide variety of different types of vehicles that, do everything from carrying people to just carrying goods and services. And, continuing on that theme of, different services, it's not just going to be the straight up type of ride-hailing services today that we have today where you pay per ride. We're going to have things like May Mobility, another company based here in Ann Arbor, that are, they've already got a deal with Bedrock in Detroit, and they're also expanding into Columbus and Grand Rapids soon, offering short, fixed route services, but also soon on-demand services, using low-speed automated shuttles. But there's also going to be premium services. Aston Martin recently showed a concept for an automated next-generation Lagonda sedan. And we've seen other concepts in the last few weeks from Renault and from Volvo, similar ideas providing premium on-demand mobility services with automated vehicles. So as part of the larger mobility ecosystem, a lot of other things are going to change as well. Traditionally, when we needed fuel, we just, when we're driving our own vehicles, we pop into a gas station, fuel it up in a few minutes, and we're on our way again. But if you're using automated vehicles in a mobility service, now there's different kinds of demands. In order for the service to be economically viable, you need to have the vehicles in operation as much of the day as possible. It's kind of like the airline model, where airlines only make money when their planes are in the air between destinations carrying passengers and cargo. They don't make money when the plane's sitting on the tarmac. Same thing is true for automated vehicles and mobility services. So we're going to see some changes in how these vehicles are handled. If they're electric vehicles, which they mostly will be, we may be using more DC fast charging. We may also be, there's other options like battery swap. Battery swap has been tried on a couple of occasions before for electric vehicles, but it wasn't viable because there wasn't enough scale. There weren't enough EVs, and the batteries weren't standardized. But if you're talking about a city that's got a fleet of, say, 1,000 automated vehicles from the same company that all have the same kind of battery in them, now you can make the charging component asynchronous from the actual operation of the vehicle. The vehicle can come in, swap the battery out in a couple of minutes, be back on the road again. Meanwhile, the battery goes on a trickle charger, and as part of that, it can also be integrated potentially into a vehicle-to-grid system where you integrate with local utilities to provide peak shaving on the electricity demand. And there's even potential, I think, for fuel cell vehicles in this kind of environment. Fuel cells have a lot of potential, but they've been problematic because of the lack of fueling infrastructure. But if you're talking about automated mobility vehicles that are operating within a geofenced area, as we are going to be for the foreseeable future, a fleet of fuel cell vehicles could easily be supported by just a small handful of hydrogen stations, as opposed to for general purpose use for individual consumers. You want a larger spread of stations over a larger area so that there's always one close by. But in a city, say San Francisco, 4 or 5 hydrogen stations could easily support a fleet of autonomous mobility vehicles and get those vehicles in and back on the road and back in service very quickly. So we're also going to be rethinking the architecture of the vehicle. We've got ideas like Toyota's e-Pallet that we saw earlier, the Navia Arma, the Local Motors Ollie, Next Future Transportation, where because these vehicles are potentially going to be utilized much more than a traditional vehicle, instead of operating 12,000, 15,000 miles a year like an individually owned vehicle, we're looking at vehicles that are going to be operating 100, 152, 300,000 miles a year, depending on how much utilization we can get out of them. And rather than scrapping out those vehicles every 3 years, and starting from scratch, instead of designing vehicles that the whole vehicle is designed to last 10, 15, 20 years or more, what we can look at is vehicles that potentially the basic structure is designed to last a long time, like an airframe, and we swap out the interiors, we swap out the batteries, swap out the motors, the electronics, the connectivity, every 2-3 years. And then we can start to use new materials for the structures that are lighter weight, stronger, but maybe less recyclable, but it doesn't matter as much because they're going to last a long time and be utilized for a long time. So this year we're starting to see the first commercial deployments of automated mobility services. May's already been operating in Detroit since May with Bedrock. And Waymo, which started off as the Google self-driving car project, is going to be launching their commercial ride-hailing service in the Phoenix area by the end of this year. GM is planning to launch their service in San Francisco sometime in 2019. Another very well-funded startup called Zoox is building their own automated mobility service vehicle. And the photo in the center bottom there is actually one of their current development vehicles. It's a Toyota Highlander, but they're developing their own vehicle from scratch that's purpose-built for this application. And they're planning to launch their service in 2020. Ford's launching in 2021. So we're going to see a whole slew of these services, but they're going to be operating in very localized areas and very limited locations for at least the next several years until the technology evolves and matures and people are really comfortable with it. As I mentioned, May is operating in Detroit. Another variety of these types of services is something that another startup out of Silicon Valley is trying, a company called Voyage. And what they're doing is they're actually focusing on a particular segment of the market. They are currently doing pilots in the San Jose retirement community and in Central Florida, a community called the Villages. A lot of retirees there, predominantly retirees there, and they're providing mobility services to the folks living there. And this is one of the key drivers for the development of automated vehicles. In addition to safety and trying to address congestion concerns, we also want to provide mobility for everybody. Freedom of mobility is important for people, especially as we get older and maybe we can't drive or you don't want to drive, or for the young or the disabled, for people that are blind. Instead of having to rely on a friend or someone to come and pick you up when you want to go somewhere, being able to just summon a vehicle to pick you up and take you where you want to go whenever you feel like it would be a huge boon to quality of life, potentially. And so Voyage is focusing on this particular sector of, working with retirement communities to provide mobility services. GM is preparing to launch their service. They recently, in a parking garage in the Embarcadero in San Francisco, installed 18 DC fast chargers so they can minimize the downtime for their fleet of Bolts. And, as we look forward to how we're going to deploy these vehicles going forward, there's a lot of things to think about for cities. With all of these variety of different services that are going to be available, if we just let everybody dive in, as has been done in many cities with the micromobility services already, we've already seen a little bit of the potential chaos. Or, with ride-hailing, with Uber and Lyft in a lot of cities, some of the increase in congestion. And so what we need to do is we need to think about how we're going to manage all of these different services and try to optimize the availability of the services to provide the maximum utility for everyone, while also trying to minimize the congestion. We need to think about things like pickup and drop-off zones, defining those, developing platforms that can allow multiple service providers to tap into that and provide optimization and make sure we get the right travel mode for each trip, so that we're not putting too many automated vehicles on the road. We're trying to get just the right amount. At the same time, also providing these other options for people. So we need to think overall about, rethinking the car for the city. The goal of all of this is to move beyond the car as just something that we own as individuals that we take whenever we need to go somewhere. As we get into more and more crowded cities, trying to save energy, trying to reduce energy consumption, and trying to improve safety. We need to rethink the role of the car in the city. So we're thinking about the vehicle architecture. We also need to think about how the city is architected to support these new forms of mobility and make it more accessible and optimize the use for everyone. Questions?
Sarah, first question, let's give you a round of applause. We will start the second panel, or the first panel at 12:45, but let's try and get as many questions in as possible. Please raise your hand, I'll get out to you.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really informative. My name is Susan Polly, and I run the Downtown Development Authority, and among other things, we run the public parking system. And we use some of those proceeds to pay for things like transit, because we're concerned about equity. We use it to also help us with our bike amenities. With what you've proposed, do you have ideas how the private sector, who's making the money from these various technologies, would find their monies coming back to the communities who are providing the bike lanes, providing the kinds of streets that you just described? Otherwise, it lands on the backs of the people who live there. How can we get those various mobility companies to pay for the things that they'll need in the right-of-way?
Yeah, that's a challenge. It's going to be a policy challenge for every municipality going forward. One of the things I didn't mention is parking. Today in the United States, we have about 7 parking spots for every car we have in this country. And in a lot of urban centers, as much as 25% of the land mass in urban centers is dedicated to parking for vehicles that are sitting there doing nothing. And if we do eventually have this transition to automated mobility services, we don't need to park those vehicles anymore. And so a lot of the parking space we dedicate to parking today can be repurposed. It can be repurposed to new residential, to commercial, and various, or even recreational uses. And so there's the potential for some new property tax revenues from those repurposed lands, but also for the services that want to come in and operate in a city. Cities need to think about, how are we going to handle that? And I think that it's incumbent upon those private sector services that are operating to maybe pay, some portion of what they're generating, some portion of their revenue, contribute that back to support the infrastructure. And particularly, if you look at it today, we pay for road infrastructure through fuel taxes predominantly. If we're using fewer cars and, we're not driving more, those revenues are also likely to evaporate. So we need to think about changes in the way we pay for road infrastructure and all this other infrastructure. Part of that may be per mile charges, charge based on vehicle mile traveled or passenger mile traveled. And transform the tax revenue system that pays for infrastructure in order to both get the road users that are utilizing that infrastructure to pay for it as part of their revenue stream. So that's going to require some significant policy changes in the way we do things today going forward.
And we'll go here to the back of the room.
This is actually following right up on that. My name is John Fournier. I'm the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Ann Arbor. And immediately before this, I was the Director of Parking for the City of Pittsburgh. And so what I wanted to ask you is what specific things cities could be doing in terms of technology implementation or infrastructure to prepare for this type of mobility future.
It's funny. Recently, John Kravchuk, the CEO of Waymo, was speaking to the National Governors Association. And during the Q&A, one of the governors asked him almost that identical question. Where should cities or states be making their investments in infrastructure and technology to support these changes? And his response was, this is going to take a lot longer than you think. This is not going to be an overnight transition. So, first of all, it's going to be a long time. Certainly, I think, places like Michigan, we're not going to be on the leading edge of a lot of commercial deployments of this technology. It's going to be in warm, sunny locations predominantly initially, particularly where you've got a very high urban density where the economics are going to make sense. But that said, I'll repeat what John's comments were. We need to focus on the core infrastructure, make sure our bridges and roads and traffic signaling systems are up to date. And then, beyond that, we need to look at, there's a bunch of companies that are working on transportation platforms that are just being designed for cities to use to integrate and coordinate the various services. So this all needs to be part of a public-private partnership. And there's companies like Ford, for example, has a transportation operating system they're developing. Toyota his recent announcement of their joint venture with SoftBank. A part of that, I think, is developing a similar kind of platform to enable coordination of these multimodal services. And so, from a municipal perspective, probably take a look at, some of these options and look at, maybe piloting some of these things or understand what will be required for that, so that when the time comes to start deploying that, we can make those changes. It's going to obviously require some updates to IT infrastructure in addition to the road infrastructure. But it's not something that we necessarily need to think about right now, but start having some conversations with the various companies that are developing these coordination platforms for mobility ecosystems.
We've got time here for one more question.
I'm Bill Milliken. With the myriad of electric vehicles coming to market, a lot of which are already using proprietary charging systems, how is the grid going to support all the demand? Is it going to continue to be hardwired? Will radiant charging have a place in the marketplace?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, aside from Tesla, pretty much everyone else is using standardized charging connectors. Most everyone is supporting the SAE combo connectors. A couple of companies are also supporting a Japanese standard called Chatamo. Tesla's the only one that really has a proprietary standard. But as far as supporting the grid infrastructure, these vehicles, automated vehicles, are going to be electrified. They need to be electrified because of the power demands of the automation systems. And in a service model, because as I said, we want to maximize the utilization, minimize downtime. I think that's one of the reasons why we're going to see companies taking a look at options like battery swapping as an alternative to DC fast charging to reduce the instantaneous loads on the grid. Demand charges, for any of you that are operating businesses and have commercial utility services, you're probably familiar with demand charges from DTE or consumers or some other utility, and that can really raise the cost and put a strain on the electrical infrastructure. So, looking at alternatives like fuel cells, like battery swapping, and also vehicle-to-grid infrastructure, because now, as I said, when we have enough of these vehicles with enough standardization, we can have enough scale to actually start making some of these ideas that we've tossed around for the last 10 or 15 years actually viable. From a technical standpoint, they've been viable, but they weren't commercially viable because of that lack of scale. There simply weren't enough EVs, but now we can actually start to do that and, perhaps coordinate parking some of the vehicles at high demand periods, plugging those in and using those as buffers to shave off peak loads. So there's a lot of potential for coordination between utilities, the service providers, cities, to make this all work better.
Sam, I'm not sure we've ever felt better about how much we don't know after hearing that. Can we give Sam Abou-Samed a